So what happened is through this development, we found Holochain, and Arthur actually suggested Holo REA and value flows protocol. And as I dug into that, I started to realize that he was absolutely right, and this was the perfect tool for us. So I could talk a little bit about REA. I'm no expert, but from my understanding, REA is just another form of accounting. And it was really developed in the early 80s in the dawn of the computer age, because computers could crunch data very quickly. And so it's another way to organize the data in an industry so we can analyze it differently. So one of the benefits of this textile industry is it's fairly simple. Making a sweater is a lot easier than making an iPhone, as an example, right? There's a lot less parts and components to think about. So over here on the left, we have our REA, components: resources, events, and agents. And this is the data you're fundamentally tracking. So in resources, we really have three things. We have the dirty fiber. That's literally the wool you take off the sheep. And then you clean that fiber. We have clean fiber. And then that fiber is spun into yarn. And then you can do whatever you want with that yarn. You can knit it, you can weave it, you can do a lot of things. Down here, we have our agents. You have your farmer. And what does the farmer do? His event is farming. Simple enough. Designers design. Truckers deliver. Washers do what we call scouring. That's simply the washing of the wool. Spinners spinning it, knitters knitting it. Simple enough. But if I back out and I show you what we're talking about here, let's go to, I have to just move this off the side because it's in my way. Let me move that there. So if we look at this middle supply chain here, I'm just moving things around. There we go. All right. So traditionally, you see we have the designer here all the way on the right, designer number 2. This designer traditionally was way over here. The designer would simply buy yarn. This is the finished yarn, and would send it to the knitting house. So this is where the designer used to sit, right here. What we've done is move the designer all the way to the front of the supply chain. That's what we're talking about. So now the designer has the ability to actually design. It can connect with the farmers, pick the resources it needs for its final product, decide where it's going to scour, where is it going to spin, which spinning mills does it want to use. It's going to have all these resources to actually work with. Now the designer can solve problems. It can look at regionalism and say, I want to use farms that are local to me. I want to use materials that belong in my bioregion, as opposed to the designer usually buying from a distributor all the way at the end of the value chain and having no control, not knowing any of the provenance of the material. So simply by moving the designer to the front, we put the designer, gave them control, gave them power. So here we have a recipe, part of this REA vocabulary. The recipe is the finished product. Here we have a pair of socks. We can trace these socks back, and we can see the socks were knit at a knitter. The knitter used input yarn. If we follow it backwards, the yarn came from a spinning mill. And now we start to see the resources tracked. We can see the blue and the brown and the pink arrows, and we can follow those back. We follow them through the delivery to the spinning mill, back to the resources. The clean fiber I talked about as one of our resources. The clean, if we're going backwards now in the supply chain, it was scoured or washed. Now in this case, these two resources were washed in one place, and the clean white wool washed in another place. I'm going to blow it up so people can see. There we go. And we track it all the way back. It's delivered. Here it's the dirty resources back to the farm. And of course, the designer choosing all these steps to create their final recipe. So a designer designs a recipe, says, I'd like to make these socks, and these are all the steps I'm going to need to take through this process. While this in itself is decentralizing, because now the designer can make these choices. And whereas in the past, the designer was simply buying yarn and had no idea where it came from. Could have come from anywhere on the planet. So that's really step one. This is a pretty simple chain. But if we scale back here a little bit, we can see designer one over here is making something else. Designer one is making a sweater in this case. And the sweater's a little bit more complicated. It used 3 yarns as opposed to down here 2 yarns. And a lot more resources, raw resources. Look at all the different kind of wool that went into it and fiber all the way back. But fundamentally the same sort of pattern. What's most interesting though is designer one and designer two share a lot of things in common. If we look at this top chain, farmer one, the same dirty white and brown alpaca here, and it follows through the chain. So what's happening is designer one and designer two are collaborating on a lot of their activity here. So if we can facilitate designer one and designer two to work together, we've created an interdependence. Now these two designers can maybe together they can buy more wool. They can reach minimums that they couldn't reach before. So now these two designers can compete with the big yarn distributor that used to exist down here. We've removed the yarn distributor, the intermediary, and put the designers in charge and let the designers collaborate to remove the intermediary. And of course, I got a third one down here where he also shares. In this case, he shares just one little piece, the pink line along the bottom. So by facilitating these connections, and we've actually done this analog. This is what Laura is doing with her work, is collaborating with other designers and saying, okay, if you buy 50 pounds from this farm, I'll buy 50 pounds. We'll buy 100 pounds together. Is this making sense?
Yeah. So you're basically, yes. It's so the marketplace or the collaboration engine, then by starting at the start, can happen at every place.
Exactly.
The value chain. And you're able to create different groups and configurations. Okay.
That's exactly right. And designers can jump in and out of collaboration.
Yeah. What got you excited? Because I can see immediately how this then matches exactly the patterns Holochain is able to create. Is that what got you excited? It's the big collaboration.
Exactly.
Stage. Okay.
Exactly. And I saw, Holochain as, I heard words like collaboration engine and decentralizing and coordinating activities. And then, of course, when I discovered REA, it really started to unfold because I could start to see these patterns. So that's really the notion, is facilitating coordination between small players, giving the small farms, the small mills, the smaller designers opportunity by working together to compete with the giant manufacturers in Bangladesh.
Okay, cool. And what do you think? So before we go back to you, Laura, and then I'm conscious I want to get to Tats and Akira in a few minutes.
Yes.
And really, what by working, thank you so much for sharing this as well.
Sure.
I love this image.
Let me stop that.
What is possible? So we have this movement, we've seen what's happening with the food movement. Now we're talking about the textile and design movement. So this movement is starting to unfold. Evolving dynamic groups are collaborating in different parts of the value chain. Like what's possible apart from competing with larger players? What else is possible in this dynamic?
So, more stakeholders benefit, when we're using this kind of a system thinking's approach. We were able to work with multiple players, multiple agents, right? We can have multiple man with a van or woman with a truck, to deliver. We can have multiple farms working, contributing perhaps smaller volumes of fiber, because in traditional supply chain scenarios, Evan might have mentioned this, but we have something called efficiencies of scale. And this kind of shifts that idea, because you have to make minimums, right? You need to have minimums in order to have a factory process something. But if we can create these efficiencies of interdependence, this is like a different approach, and it enables a different growth logic. Because right now the growth logic inherently centralizes, and the underpinning is, of course, our economic system. I don't think we even started to talk about complementary currencies, because we feel like those.
Yeah, I want to mention that. I'm going to mention that.
Well,
can I jump in? I'll talk about that, Laura.
Sure.
Let me go back to this map. So when we go back to this map, one of the things we've recognized here as well is this designer has a geographic location. They have a zip code. And this farmer has a location, and this washer has a location. When the designer has the ability now to make these choices and these decisions, they can choose localism, and we can reward that localism. That's where our complementary currencies come in. So if this designer chooses a farm that's 50 miles away as opposed to 500 miles away, maybe the designer is rewarded 3 points. I'm being, X number of localism points. But remember, as we move through this supply chain, we're collecting sort of localism points. Those localism points, that localism score, is imbued into the final product. Assume this sweater has a little QR code that suggests that illuminates the whole provenance. The QR code can point back to this whole chain and tell you now that this sweater has earned 10 localism points. That's deep wealth. That's deep value built right into the product. We can measure localism. We could also measure things like this farmer is practicing carbon drawdown on their farm. They're using we call it climate beneficial farming practices. So crop rotation and no-till and all different things that will help draw carbon back into the soil. So we can reward this farmer for those practices. And remember, the designer is choosing the farmer.
Yeah.
So those values,
sense.
Those values will now be imbued into the final product. So this sweater can have a localism score. It could have a carbon drawdown score. It could have a compostability score. Maybe the spinner here is using renewable energy. Maybe they're running on solar power. Or we can measure ethical practices. Yeah. How is the spinner paying their employees? Are they paying them minimum wage, a fair living wage? We can measure the ethical business practices. Maybe calculate that into the final product.
Yeah.
So we want to simply by having access to all the data, and that's all a result of putting the designer in the front. Because when we put the designer in the front, now we have access to all the data.
Right. And I think that, the Holochain platform is so, this idea of systems integrity is so great, reputational currency to, is someone delivering on time? Are they finishing, their processing on time? All of these can be given value, these are value flows. So we're really excited about Holochain, using that for this purpose. But I also want to stress diversity as well, because I think that this system also helps to encourage diversity, like just in terms of economic diversity, as I mentioned, with many stakeholders benefit, like multiple mills can work together, multiple designers can collaborate, the delivery services, like all of it, every single piece of that value chain can be economically more diverse, but then also my material diversity as well. Because going back to this idea of economy of scale with, our typical traditional supply chains, usually, you can only process one color of fiber, one type of fiber into one type of yarn, to make minimums. But with this kind of scenario, it can enable us to use different colored fiber and have that processed. So as a designer, you could be processing like brown, gray, and white fiber, like all for the same, all at the same time, rather than just one color. I mean, it really helps, diversify things.